Hello and welcome to this guide to Chapter 4, The Carew Murder Case.
What is this feeling of power and drive I've never known? I feel alive. Where does this feeling of power derive, making me know why I'm alive? Like the night, it's a secret, sinister, dark, and unknown. I do not know what I seek, yet I'll seek it alone. I have a thirst that I cannot deprive. Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive. Like the moon, an enigma, lost and alone in the night. Damned by some heavenly stigma, but blazing with light. It's the feeling of being alive, filled with evil but truly alive. It's the truth that cannot be denied. It's the feeling of being Edward Hyde.
Here's the user's guide then on the screen. As you can see how to use this resource, please pause the video now to work out how best to use it. The three things we're graded for then, you've got AO1, understanding what the book is about, AO2, its language, form and structure, and AO3, its context. As normal, we're going to cover many of the key themes here listed at the end of this video as we work out how this chapter fits in to the novel as a whole. So what does Stevenson want us to remember about Chapter 4? This is the most violent chapter in the novel, the brutal murder of Sir Danvers Carew at the hands of Mr. Hyde. In this chapter then, what do we learn about our key characters, either Jekyll or Hyde, or both? Well, Hyde is described with an ill-contained impatience, he broke out, flame of anger, madman, and ape-like, last with deformity and fugitive. Stevenson makes clear Hyde's darkest side as we are witness to the brutal slaying of Sir Danvers Carew, a member of the aristocracy. Hyde finally broke out of society's rules and expectations and, like a madman, smashes the symbol of civilization and reason, Carew. Stevenson turns Hyde into a fugitive who now exists outside of reason and the law. Let's then begin to summarise Chapter 4.
Chapter 4, which is about 1 year later, it's early in the morning when a maid sees a man beat to death. She identifies the attacker as Mr. Hyde. The victim turns out to be Sir Danvers Carew, a prominent member of Parliament. Utterson leads the police to Hyde's address, where they find a burnt checkbook and the murder weapon. The police figure out that Hyde still has an open account at the bank. They plan to stake it out and wait for Mr. Hyde to come close the account, but he never shows.
So what happens in Chapter 4? 1 year later, this chapter is set 1 year later, a maid sees Mr. Hyde kill Sir Danvers Carew. The police find a letter on the body addressed to Utterson. He names the body and goes with the police to Hyde's house after recognising the murder weapon. Utterson and the police go to Hyde's house, but he's gone and his house appears ransacked. Utterson and the police find Hyde's bank account is still open. Stevenson presents us with different interpretations of the murder. Is Hyde the nightmare ruining the dream, wonderful life in London and people at the time? Or are there hints at possible homosexual relations between the two men meeting in the middle of the night?
In Chapter 4 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a year passes without incident. But then, a savage murder occurs. A young maidservant is looking out the window at the moon when she sees a white-haired gentleman and Hyde meet on the street outside. She recognizes Hyde because he had once visited her employer. The two men talk, and then Hyde suddenly beats the older man to death with his cane. The maid calls for help, but Hyde is gone when the police arrive. They find Carew's watch, money, and a letter addressed to Mr. Utterson on the dead body. When they take the letter to Mr. Utterson, he accompanies them to view the body. He identifies it as Sir Danvers Carew, a respected gentleman and a client of Utterson's. Utterson then guides the police to Hyde's home, located in a disreputable part of town. Hyde's villainous-looking maid lets the men in, but informs them that Hyde is not home. Utterson and the police inspector search the house and find that Hyde uses only 2 rooms, leaving the rest of the house empty. Those rooms, though expensively furnished, are in a chaotic state, as if ransacked, and a number of partially burned papers sit by the fireplace. They find the murder weapon, the broken cane, and the burned remains of Hyde's checkbook. They then visit Hyde's bank and find that he still has thousands of pounds there. This encourages the police inspector, who thinks that he is sure to come get the money. In the days and weeks that follow, no sign of Hyde turns up. He has no family, no friends, nobody who's seen him can describe his appearance as anything but evil.
As you can see then, this one is particularly set in a certain part of London. You can see on the screen a map of London at the time. Hyde attacks Sir Danvers out of nowhere, and it's safe to assume that Stevenson's Danvers was a respected part of the community. This would lead Londoners of the time to fear for their lives. London was a very busy place, a new kind of multicultural busy metropolis that the world had never known before. For one of the first times in history, people wouldn't know their own neighbours. Many of the people who lived in London would have come from villages or the countryside, so the idea of suddenly being right next to this number of people would have been quite confusing and quite scary.
Have sailed the world, beheld its wonders, from the Dardanelles to the mountains of Peru, but there's no place like London.
No, there's no place like London.
Mr. Todd?
You are young, life has been kind to you. You will learn. There's a hole in the world like a great black pit, and the vermin of the world inhabit it, and its morals aren't worth what a pig could spit, and it goes by the name of London. At the top of the hole sit a privileged few, making mock of the vermin in the lower zoo, turning beauty into filth and greed. I too have sailed the world and seen its wonders, for the cruelty of men is as wondrous as Peru. But there's no place like London.
As you can see, Sweeney Todd there going to London for the first time and describing his flea-ridden pit. Now, the printing press was invented in 1476, and since then the birth of the modern era of the press was born. The Penny Pitwick, among others, sold copies in London informing the citizens of the news of the day. Criminals that would otherwise have been unknown became infamous tabloid headlines that made people fear their neighbours. This is what Stevenson accidentally capitalised on in his novel Jekyll and Hyde. Here we have then the Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd, otherwise known as the Deben Barber of Fleet Street, was around in 1775, so a little bit too early to be an influence on Stevenson's writing. The infamous Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was plaguing Whitechapel in 1888. Jekyll and Hyde was published in 1886, so the readers would have been drawing connections here between Hyde and Jack the Ripper, particularly as Jack was thought to have been a surgeon. Again, Stevenson wasn't inspired by Jack the Ripper, but certainly the events of Whitechapel were going on while people were reading Jekyll and Hyde. Let's begin breaking the chapter down then, looking at some key extracts from it before we move on to some of the key themes. We have then, first off, a description of Sir Danvers. Stevenson presents us with a hyperbolized Sir Danvers Carew, who represents the old established hierarchy of London. Stevenson implies to us the homosexual nature of the encounter at around 2 AM as two gentlemen meet in a lane. Stevenson has Danvers highlighted by the moon to imply his truthfulness and goodness, yet Hyde is forced into shadow. Stevenson implies that Hyde is impatient and emotional, which foreshadows the brutality to come. Stevenson takes a high member of aristocracy and reduces him to his basics, a man of the earth, implying that man can easily be taken back to his instinctual, primeval self. A key quote from this chapter: "All of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger," in this case describing Hyde. Stevenson confronts us with a volatile Hyde who's unpredictable and uncivilized. He is in no way provoked by Sir Danvers. The past tense verb broke is repeated in the chapter and emphasises Hyde's escape or destruction of society's rules and manners. This leads us to think that Hyde's reactions have been building up to this moment where he's finally and literally free of Jekyll's will and control. The noun phrase "great flame" implies the explosion of energy almost biblical in its size and power, as if the real evil of Hyde is now released into the world. The murder weapon itself is a metaphor for Dr. Jekyll. We have there a description of the stick in this case, and it's described with some very rare and tough wood, broken in the middle under the stress, rolled in the neighbour's gutter, and broken and battered. Just like the cane Hyde carried, Jekyll is a unique man who is a gentleman, but has darkness at heart. It has been tough for Hyde to beat him and break free. Yet, now Hyde has finally cracked Dr. Jekyll in two and won the battle for his soul. The upper class and civilised Jekyll has been brought down to the gutter by his darker half, suddenly breaking through Jekyll and becoming the evil in the world. We now come across then a description of Hyde's house. Stevenson deliberately has Hyde only live in the back rooms of the house, further implying that Hyde lives in the recesses of Jekyll's consciousness. Stevenson gives us the image of Hyde as less barbaric than we might first imagine. He is intellectual and appreciates beauty, but in his own terms and rules. The extended metaphor of this being Jekyll's consciousness is explored here as the room is ransacked, implying that Hyde is turning over Jekyll, destroying, corrupting order and logic. Stevenson asks us to reflect on Jekyll's mind being burned or destroyed by Hyde. The burning of the checkbook in the fire implies that civilised thoughts based on financial stability, which Hyde needs to destroy to be free. The fact the book is green presents us with Jekyll's innocence and purity against Hyde's dark and black nature. Now let's look at some of the key themes in Jekyll and Hyde. First up, looking at setting. At this point in the chapter, Stevenson gives us an alternative view of London than he stated previously. This is seen from a maid's point of view as she looks out a window. London is romanticised as a city of dreams and opportunity. It is a beautifully lit city and cloudless, and the maid is romantically given as she observed an aged and beautiful gentleman who appeared the very manner of politeness and an old world kindness. With the eruption of violence, Stevenson soon juxtaposes this idyllic view of London with the great chocolate-coloured paw lowered over heaven, metaphorically smothering London in the fumes and smog of the Industrial Revolution. Then the reference to chocolate also implies it's addictive and desirable. We are told there is a glow of a rich lurid brown conflagration, implying that Hyde's crime and sins are like a sickness in London that is detestable to see and smell. Stevenson describes his area of London as growling, and in fact it's Soho he's describing. This idea of a growling or animal-like London returns in chapter 4 as Hyde's evil spreads. We see the results of mankind's sins on the city. The dingy street, filled with gin palaces, confronts us with addictions and squalor of the working class in London. We hear of the homelessness of the innocent, with ragged children huddled in doorways. We meet Hyde's servant, described as ivory-faced, implying a woman drained of emotion due to the cold, harsh reality of London in 1886. The story, now linking to the theme of repression, the story, as I've said before, skips forward 1 year to get to chapter 4, by which time we could guess that Hyde's sins have escalated to the point where Jekyll can no longer repress Hyde. The semantic field of freedom from repression is clear. Ill-contained impatience, he broke out, Hyde broke out, and fugitive. These all clearly imply escape from captivity, as if Hyde is now free from society's constraints, rules, manners, and laws. It is important now to consider that Hyde is no longer a free man. He is wanted by the law as a criminal. Yet it's also quite interesting to look at Hyde's victim, Sir Danvers. His title, Sir, implies aristocracy and upper class. He is a rule maker. His kindness and purity, much like the girl in chapter 1, is hyperbolized to an almost dreamlike quality. Innocent, old-world kindness which established him as a member of the elite, a man who represents an ideal creator of the 18th century. Danvers' demeanour is described as well-founded self-content, implying that Danvers is a happy man who takes pleasure in the world he created, a direct contrast to the London previously described. Danvers is assaulted and literally destroyed by Hyde, as we are forced to imagine bones audibly shattered and a body incredibly mangled. Hyde doesn't destroy the man, he destroys the idealistic upper-class worldview he represents. The picture-perfect metropolis that is how London wanted to present itself to the rest of the world. Now let's look at the theme of religion. Great flame of anger and hailing storm of blows both imply a sense of not just Hyde's power, but an almost biblical force that he represents. Stevenson explores Hyde's power as an almost biblical force, punishing mankind for its sins in chapter 4. The great flame inside Hyde implies a vengeful God who is reaping divine retribution on man for destroying the world he created through the Industrial Revolution and/or Darwinism, taking the population a direction away from the church. The phrase hailing storm of blows almost implies a plague sent from heaven, as Hyde is imagined as an unstoppable supernatural force. Of course, the key theme of science is here, with the main quote arguably of the whole book, ape-like. Stevenson read or heard about Darwin's theory of evolution when he was 9, and this would have had a profound effect on his life and beliefs. During the 19th century, the things we recognise as sciences formed and acquired their great cultural authority. The sciences developed in contexts shaped by the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the sweeping social and cultural changes of the century. Historians of science over the last 40 years have come to see sciences as not something independent and distinct from culture and social life, but as integral to other social concerns and as part of culture itself. This might be why Stevenson chose the distinct phrase ape-like to describe Hyde, as he is a man who represents what we were against Jekyll to represent what we became. Jekyll is the evolution of Hyde. So what is evolution?
There have always been people who find evolution hard to believe, although it's more than thoroughly proven. At first, not even Darwin could believe it. So how did he come to write and publish one of the most important and controversial theories in science history? Charles Darwin had always wanted to study nature, even though his father wanted him to be a doctor or a priest. Defying him, young Darwin embarked on a ship sent to chart the coasts of South America because he wanted to collect and study exotic animal specimens. What he found on the 5-year trip would lead him to question his beliefs. What if species weren't as permanent and perfect as everyone thought? In Argentina, Darwin found fossils of what looked like giant armadillos and sloths. Clearly, these animals had existed at some point, but they didn't anymore. This made Darwin suspect species had changed over time, in line with some existing but unpopular theories. He had also seen mockingbirds, and when he got to the Galapagos, he found different mockingbird species on the islands, distinct among each other and from the mainland species. Because of their sheer similarity and closeness, Darwin hypothesized that they had a common ancestor whose specimens had flown to the islands and changed there. However, something was missing. How did this change happen? Darwin's inspiration came from an economist, Thomas Malthus, who believed that humans reproduced faster than their food supply. Darwin realized that animals always breed beyond their available resources, so the individuals who were better at surviving would be the ones to reproduce. This way, they would pass on any traits that had helped them survive. Everything fit together, but there was a final hurdle. Darwin, like the society he lived in, was deeply religious, and all the evidence he'd found contradicted Christian beliefs. It would take him over 20 years to write and publish his revolutionary book on the origin of species, but when he finally did, it became one of the most influential scientific treatises of all time.
The Victorian age witnessed some of the most fundamental transformations of beliefs about nature and the place of humans in the universe, famously led by Charles Darwin. His book, Origins of the Species, was very controversial and began to make the deeply religious people of England question their faith. Darwin knew that deep in his heart he had discovered something amazing, and knew that his religious friends wouldn't understand. It was a bit like confessing a murder, that he knew but he had to let his theories be known, even though he might suffer for it. Some of the major transformations which occurred across the Victorian period were the change from natural philosophy and natural history to science, the shift from gentlemen and clerical naturalists to, for the first time, professional scientists, and the development and eventual diffusion of belief in natural laws and ongoing process. Secularization, growing interaction between the sciences, government and industry, and the formalization of science education and the growing internationalism of science. When investigating transmutation of the species, Darwin knew that his naturalist friends thought this a bestial heresy, undermining miraculous justifications for the social order, the kind of radical argument then being used by dissenters and atheists to attack the Church of England's privileged position as the established church. Though Darwin wrote of religion as a tribal survival strategy, he still believed that God was the ultimate lawgiver. It was likely that Stevenson thought the same. Darwin's belief dwindled, and at the death of his daughter Annie in 1851, Darwin finally lost all faith in Christianity. He continued to help the local church with parish work, but on Sundays he'd go for a walk while his family attended church. He now thought it better to look at pain and suffering as a result of general laws rather than direct intervention by God. When asked about his religious views, he wrote that he'd never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God, and that in generally an agnostic would be more correct describing his state of mind. But this, in the book of course, Hyde comes from within Jekyll. How does this link to the survival of the fittest?
He called the survival of the fittest. In any environment, plants and animals from the same species show natural variation in their physical characteristics, such as neck length in giraffes. Darwin suggested that those plants and animals best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Over a long period of time, the characteristics of the surviving members of the species will come to predominate. Confused? Take the peppered moth. In London in the early 1800s, 98% of peppered moss had light-coloured bodies, only 2% were dark. The light moss were very happy because they were the same colour as the trees, which meant that they could easily hide from hungry birds. The dark peppered moss were easy to see and, well, eat. Then came the factories and the smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Many trees turned black with soot, and suddenly it was the dark moss who were able to survive better in their environments. By 1895, the dark peppered moss made up 95% of the population. That's quite a turnaround. The process of natural selection usually takes much longer, but this is a good example of how it works. What about us humans? Good question. Darwin went on to suggest that humans share a common ancestor with modern apes. This was controversial because it went against the religious beliefs of many people. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection had a great impact on the world. Today, it is widely accepted as our best scientific explanation of how life on Earth works.
Does that mean that Stevenson is daring to imply that only by being more aggressive can we actually survive as a species? The theme of violence. As already explored, this is the most violent chapter in the novella. Startled by a crime of singular ferocity. This implies that London was shocked by a crime so violent it was seen as shocking. The word ferocity implies an animal-like nature of the crime. The verb startled is repeated later in the chapter, further implying the shocking horror of the crime. Like a madman. Stephen implies that Hyde is insane here, a man who is not subject to reason or thought, yet we are told in brackets, as the maid described it, suggesting that Hyde had a purpose to destroy the symbol of order, control and civility. He wasn't, in fact, mad. Stamping with his foot. Stevenson has Hyde repeat the same action as chapter 1, as he implies that Hyde views the innocent lives of London as beneath him, a group that is not worthy of his presence. Storm of blows. Stevenson makes Hyde an unstoppable biblical force that cannot be stopped by money or respectability. He will not be caged by class or social position. Hyde epitomises biblical wrath as he destroys mankind's seemingly civilised self. Some key quotes then from this chapter. What does Stevenson want us to think at the end of this chapter? Stevenson challenges us to look beyond the obvious nature of Hyde, begging us to explore Hyde's motives and his relationship with the upper classes and Jekyll himself. Stevenson gives us clues about Hyde's motivations, but never explains them. Some key quotes then from this chapter. As the novella develops, the evil, unstoppable nature of Hyde comes to focus. Underneath each quote is a level 5 example of what you might write about it. Let's move on then to essay skills. Today we're going to focus on how Hyde is presented and look at a whole essay and how it might be graded. This is the essay itself then. I looked this up actually on Google and this was on one of the student forums asking somebody to grade it. So this is my view of this extract, of this example. Comments down the right hand side then will be what I would say about it. The opening is very simplistic. This could be extended a little bit by looking at context, getting marks for AO3, and could alternatives be made? This second paragraph clearly links to Stevenson's motives and intentions and how this is presented at the start of the book. That's good to always look at the beginning of the book, then the middle, then the end, so you can see how a theme or character progresses. More quotes and points need to be made here though to get higher grades. Paragraph 3 kind of states the obvious without really exploring why Stevenson has his characters react this way. Once again, context could be used here to gain more marks. I'd expect to see perhaps a deeper exploration of exactly why Stevenson uses the words that he does to describe Hyde. This is better. Paragraph 4 then begins to really get the grade. Clear analysis shown where this candidate zoomed in on individual words. However, technical devices and some exploration of how the characters change would show deeper understanding. And lastly, we have at the end here clear use of particular words here that are fully explained, but Once again, your explanation only refers to one single word quote. So actually, although a lot's been said, the actual quote is only 2 words long, or even 1 word long, and perhaps you'd want to use the whole sentence that quote comes from before zooming in on a particular detail. Overall, clear evidence is used and explained with the candidate beginning to analyse the text, with some links to context and a range of points made that links to the question set. I think this would get around about a 3+ in the actual exam. Here then is the same essay, but in this case I've highlighted in yellow the different bits I've added or changed and crossed out the bits that are no longer needed. I've added a clear alternative given to show exploration of the text. I've added technical language and added more detail to justify my points. I've added the reactions to the crowd during that first chapter when Hyde is first described. I've gone into a bit of more depth here as well, linking to the message or meaning of the book. I've shown deeper insight into what Stevenson is trying to tell us in the book through his use of description. You can see a lot's been added there to the 4th paragraph. Thank you very much then for listening to this guide to Jekyll and Hyde.